Good morning, afternoon or evening everybody. Welcome back to part 2 of this build series of U99. Last time out we completed the hull, adding in some much needed details to the otherwise blank canvas that was supplied. If you missed this, you can rewind using the link above. This time out we are going to focus on finishing the build phase. This will involve constructing the conning tower, resin printing some guns and adding the rigging. So without further ado, let's get cracking. The first stage is adding the stern dive flaps, props and rudders. I cut out all the components and clean them up as usual, using some snips, a scalpel and some sandpaper. Then I attach the 2 propellers to some cocktail sticks and put them aside for painting later. With all the parts cut out, it's the task of attaching the components to the hull. The dive flaps are attached to the props and these are cemented to the hull in one piece, nothing too tricky here. Next, it's time to attach the rudders. These are a tad more fiddly, as they almost require a third hand to do it easily. The rudders sit in position. Then there is a support structure that holds them in place from the top. This took a fair bit of playing with to get them to sit in place. Finally, once attached, I go over all the joins with the quick dry cement to ensure a good hold. With that done, we can move on to constructing the conning tower. First parts are constructing the periscope, which has a 2-part base that needs building. Then the hatch is attached to the top deck, along with the hinge plate and some further detail to the front. With the deck details added, I move on to the conning tower sides. I'm going to be making my own life rings and some new metal ladders. So I proceed to cutting the molded life rings off with a scalpel and clean it up with some sandpaper. Next, I cut off the existing molded ladder handles and drill the positions for the new metal ones, ready to be made and attached later. Now all the preparation is done, I can attach the 2 halves of the conning tower together, sandwiching the deck in between. Unfortunately, the fit isn't exactly seamless, so I get it as smooth as possible in preparation for some filling. To fill the seams in, I'm using Tamiya putty again. I generously add to all the seams and get rid of some of the excess with a cocktail stick. Once cured, the cleanup mission begins, cutting off the excess with a scalpel and sanding smooth. With the whole thing smoothed down, it's time to add some more rivets. I draw out all the positions first with a pencil, so at least I have a guide to follow with the rivet tool. Once drawn, I start to add the rivets. It was quite tricky to get into all the areas I wanted, so they're not the most clear rivets in the world, but I always say some detail is better than no detail. With the rivet detail added, I can now make and fit the metal ladder handles. For these, I am using this Florist wire from the range. I make the first bend with a pair of needle nose pliers, then measure the size from my drilled holes or the last handle made. Then make the second bend. Finally, I snip off the excess metal. The handles are now ready to be attached to the conning tower. I put them through the drilled holes and glue them in place using VMS CA black super glue, both on the outside and the inside. A small amount of adjusting later, and the handles are in place. The final pieces to add to the conning tower are the twin periscopes. These simply slide in and are glued in place from the inside. The Type 7 U-boats had 2 periscopes, an observation periscope for navigating and an attack periscope for attacking. Before I attach the conning tower, I quickly fit the front dive flaps to the hull. These are a simple one-piece construction, simply glued in place with the extra thin cement. Now I attach the conning tower to the hull. Nice and simple really, although I did have to hold it down a fair while to get it to stay in place. I run cement all around the outside to ensure a good hold. Now it's time for some finer details, starting with the 88mm deck gun. The kit parts were woeful to say the least, so I printed my own using a file from Cults. The file wasn't the correct scale and wouldn't print in one piece, so I had to modify it a fair bit, drawing on my own details and printing in components. The pieces are tiny and was quite fiddly putting them together, but once built I put it aside for painting separately. I did the same thing with the flak gun for the top deck, printed and put it aside for painting. Next, the railings are fitted. Not sure why this wasn't recorded, but they were simply glued in place. The top net cutters are also fitted to the front. Again, apologies for the lack of recording, but was a tad fiddly mainly due to the lack of quality of the parts. Some further detail is added to the deck. Then I fit the railings. Geez, this was a mistake using the kit parts. They had so much flash on them it was hard to believe. The fit was absolutely awful, and to top it all off, they are miles out of scale. I should have made my own railings here and on the conning tower, really. Eventually they are fitted in place. Then it's time to fit the rear rigging supports, and again these were awful. The quality of the parts and the fitment is insanely bad for such basic parts. One of them had not been molded correctly and was broken on the sprue, so I had to create a third leg for it. This was a lot of faff for 2 tiny parts, but got them fitted eventually. With the main bulk of components added, we can now start the rigging. For this, I am using some black thread, which seems to be about the right scale. First, I measure the lengths of thread I need. Then, to stop them going fluffy when painting, I coat the lengths in PVA glue. Then we can start fitting them to the boat. I start on the stern, first adding some super glue to the first fixing point, then carefully tie the thread around and hold until it cures. Then, I attach to the rigging support just behind, again using super glue and holding until it cures. I work my way up the hull onto the conning tower and attach the rigging to the next support section. This process is repeated all the way around, leaving a loose half loop at the front and finishing where we started at the stern. For the bow rigging, I start at the loose half loop and thread it through the gap, then gluing and holding in place whilst it cures. I then loop the thread through the front net cutter, adjust the positioning and glue in place. All that's left to do is trim off the excess. The final part to the rigging is to add the tensioners. For this, I use some epoxy putty. I mix up a small amount of the putty, then roll into a thin sausage, the approximate thickness of my tensioners. Then I simply cut it into chunks and apply to the rigging. I didn't record that part for some strange reason, but hopefully you get the gist. With the boat fully built, that's where we are going to leave this video. Next time out, we will start the painting process, pre-shading, masking, and painting. But for now, thank you for watching. If you haven't already, please hit those like and subscribe buttons and let me know your thoughts in the comments. For now, farewell and happy modeling, everybody.